At this point, I would like to welcome our speakers to the Q&A session. Thank you to our audience for your interesting and thought-provoking questions. There are also some lovely comments I've noticed in the chat as well. So thank you very much for engaging with us and with our speakers. And I wonder if I may start off with a question to all of our speakers, which is about the role and the importance of volunteers in your respective organisations, because it's something that was touched upon both by someone who asked a question to Mazin, but also just now in Sergei's talk as well. So over to the speakers.
Well, I can start. Thank you. Volunteers are critical. We wouldn't have been able to do this institute, both the Botanic Garden and the museum without volunteers. I actually myself, I'm a volunteer. I founded this institute about 7 years ago with my own money, and my wife's, also is a full-time volunteer. So most of our work is done by volunteers. We only recently have increased our staff to 8, which seems a lot, but we have more than twice that many in long-term volunteers with us.
Thank you very much, Mazin. That's very good to hear.
Can I just comment for a short while? Here at the University of Bristol Botanic Garden, the volunteer community is a large and diverse community. During the summer months, it can be up to 100, 120 people each month volunteering here at the garden. Obviously, there is the practical volunteer gardeners. That can be pre-COVID, that was up to 50 people during the summer months and drops to about 32 during the winter months. But we work very closely. They're integrated into the teams of staff. Volunteers are trained. There's a strict sort of rota when they arrive, when they leave. And there's a huge respect from the volunteers for the garden, and vice versa from us as a community of staff to the volunteers for what they do. It's certain that we would not be able to maintain or have relocated and developed a new botanic garden 16 years ago without volunteer support. A lot of the volunteers come from our Friends organisation, but some are not members of the Friends, but it's a very vibrant and essential community of people.
Thanks ever so much, Nick. And as I bring up the questions, I think you've won an award, have you not, at Bristol for volunteering? Because
yes, the volunteer group here at the University Botanic Garden Bristol were nominated from the community, and in 2018 were presented with the Queen's Voluntary Service Award, which is a huge accolade for the community, and it also involved senior team right up through to the Vice Chancellor at the university coming to present, help present the award, along with the assistance of the Duke of Kent. That's the Queen's first cousin, who was our guest of honour at that very, very special event. So it's great that the volunteers got that recognition.
Congratulations, Nick. Thank you. And I'm going to move to one of our first questions, which is for you, Andreas. I loved your talk very much, which will surprise no one, particularly some of your wonderful pictures of plants feasting on butterflies, quite macabre. And we have a question from Amanda, which is, how do the predator insects, so those that I think you call them kleptoparasites, they're stealing prey, but they're not being trapped themselves?
So there are basically two mechanisms. One is an avoidance strategy, which, for example, the assassin bugs, these sundew bugs, do. So they do not touch these tentacles. They only walk on the stalks and on the non-sticky parts. And the other thing is defensive mechanisms. So this is, for example, the Buchlaria caterpillars, which I showed. They eat up first the dangerous parts of the leaf, the tentacles, but also the caterpillars. They're covered in long bristles, which easily break off. So if they touch the glue, for example, then just these bristles break off, but the caterpillar itself can escape. And there are also other defensive mechanisms. We discovered, for example, a system of a hoverfly larvae in Brazil, which lives on the sundew leaves and feeds on the captured prey. And this hoverfly does not cause the leaves to bend or the tentacles to move. And first we thought it producing some chemical substances to protect itself, but it's quite simple actually. Fly larvae, the cuticle is covered by a thin film of slime, which is basically water. So they swim on this film of water, and it was already Charles Darwin which showed that sundew leaves, they're not reacting upon rain droplets, for example, because it's rainwater. So they just hide themselves by covering them in a suit of water. So this is defensive mechanisms then again.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andreas. We have quite a few questions. I'm not sure I'll get through all of them. We might go over a bit, but we're in a break, so people can leave if they need to. But I wonder, Sergey, you took us through your wonderful collections and your you mentioned glasshouse collections. You also said red list plants from Russia, very rare plants from Russia, I think. Tell us more about your rare plants in Russia that you grow.
Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, I understand better than speak English. So I asked for help in translating Vadim Gataulin. He is the head of the International Relations Departments of PEM University, and he is a coordinator of Oxford PEM Relations from Russian side.
Welcome to the discussion.
Thank you. Коллекция растений, занесенных в Красную книгу России, начала создаваться у нас с 2003 года.
The collection of the red list species was founded in
2003 года.
In 2003.
В настоящее время в коллекции насчитывается более 40 видов растений.
Currently, there are more than 40 points in the list of the species.
Большая часть их выращивается в условиях открытого грунта.
Most of them are planted in the open ground.
Но и есть виды, которые выращиваются у нас в оранжерее. Это субтропические виды.
And some of them are planted in the greenhouse, the tropical and subtropical plants.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And it seemed to be a common theme actually I picked up in some of the talks, and so in a moment I might ask Nick relating to some questions we have about the native plants in Bristol as well. But perhaps before I do that, Mazin, we could talk about the native plants in your particular botanic garden. And I think we had a specific question as well that was in the chat, which was about a particular resource. I know that you answered in the chat and that there was a link, but I wonder if you wanted to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of indigenous plants here and endemic plants also, and rare plants in the garden alone. Actually, we counted last, I mentioned in my talk is 50, but it's actually 61 rare species of plants. And we just published a paper on rare species of plants. And we are trying now to even use rare species of plants as cultivars, including developing things with tissue culture and so forth, so that we can encourage people to grow them around their houses instead of growing, exotic and other species. We also have a problem with invasive species that we didn't talk about that we need to kind of address, because it turns out to be more serious problem than we thought that we have to deal with. The question you were referring to is from Rania, and I'm sorry I relocated it by accident. I was talking about heirloom seeds and native species. And yes, we do need to encourage use of of native species. We have a seed library here at the Botanic Garden in our Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability. And we're starting to use DNA methodologies for documenting and for identifying and barcoding these species. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area. Our biggest limitation is actually not money. I think we can probably, we've been successful at getting grant money. I mentioned some of the funders, for example. Our biggest challenge has been finding good technical qualified people to do the work and advice and so forth. So we could use some technical help in this, and labor is more important than money, in my humble opinion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mazin. And I have a question in Andreas for a moment, but before that, Nick, there are a couple of questions for you about the native plants, which were a focus of your talk. And we had a question from Suzanne Renner, which was about the diversity of sorbus, the microspecies in Bavaria, for example. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a bit more about, she asked for an explanation in short of the diversity of why we've got so many different, a diversity of sorbus growing in the Avon Gorge.
Well, one of the significant factors is the microclimatology of the Avon Gorge. The actual gorge itself is quite large. It's over 2 miles in length. And as the river twists and turns, you have all these different rock faces facing different points of the compass. And the environment in which the sorbus grow it's a sheltered environment. And one of the theories for why there's such diversity is that in the post-glacial period, there was a period of immediate warming for a period of time before the climate returned to what we have today, which is a sort of temperate, cooler, temperate climate. And in that period, that allowed species from mainland Europe to colonize southern Britain, including the Bristol area. And Leeward's has Sorbus torminalis in it, Sorbus aurea, Sorbus torminalis, and there's an ancestor of many of the apomictic species in the gorge, which is now extinct, which grew in that area. And the environment, the microclimatological aspects of the gorge allowed these plants to have successful pollination and fertilization of the seed to produce new offspring. So for that, you need warm weather for the pollinators to be active. You also need the warmth to fuel the growth. So once they've been pollinated, for the pollen tube to grow down the style, and you need a period of consistent warmth for that development and for the ovule to get fully fertilized by the pollen sperm. So we find when we collect seed of sorbus seed each year, you can have a lot of fruit, but you get these years where actually inside the seed is what we refer to as blind. You know, it's got all the seed coat there, but inside there's nothing inside. And if you put a float test, it will just float to the surface and it will not germinate. You can correspond that back to cold days or bad weather periods at flowering time. And then you get good years where you've had a good spring, and then you'll get years with lots of plump seed, which sink in a flotation test. You sow them and they'll germinate. It is a problem for conservation because we're growing plants under contract at the moment for the local authority to the south of the city, North Somerset, with some other partners. And we've just received the delivery of sorbus seed for this year, which is being processed at the moment. And 2/3 of it will not germinate. So raising new plants each year it can be quite an issue. You've got to collect seed each year. So the diversity back in the gorge, certainly the geographical formation of the gorge, its aspect, the way it faces south-southwest, traps warm air, has allowed these hybrids to take place, in which many of these hybrids have then crossed back with members of their parentage to produce new apomictic hybrids. So, and then we also have to look at the land use of the area as well, which of course has changed over time. But on the leeward side, it has been open woodland grazing, but the steep slopes of the gorge have been semi-natural woodland for a very long time. And this kind of depth of time has allowed these trees to stand in areas where humans can't get to chop them down. And so there is this time for these genetic individuals to then have an opportunity to cross-pollinate with other genetic individuals and for this community of soils to build up.
Very interesting approach to conservation, to conserving evolutionary processes. So rather than sort of stamp collecting and taking particular plants, I think, and Suzanne mentioned that in Bavaria there are these numerous microspecies because of course it's the same evolutionary process, apomixis, this asexual seed production, this instant reproductive isolation of these novel microspecies, these polyploids from their sexual progenitors, and I suppose your approach is to conserve this snapshot of a complex evolutionary process, which adds a whole different dimension, I think, to the conservation.
And that's why the Avon Gorge and Downs Wildlife Project is actually critical, because all the landowning partners and the agencies that manage those areas of land are part of that partnership, and we all sit around the table and decide on policy and our actions of what we're going to do. And sure, sometimes we don't agree on everything, but that's part of the discussion process, and that was formed, that organisation, to bring all these landowners, which I showed on the map, together.
Thank you very much. And so I'm just going to come to a couple of questions. Well, we've got one for you, Andreas, which is from Trevor, and he asks, has anyone compared sundew growth in an insect-free environment compared to that which has insects?
So the role of insect food for the growth of sundews. Yes, there had been some studies on this, and interestingly, they do not die without insect prey, because what they found out is that, well, they invest the nutrients they get from the prey, which is mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, which they cannot get from the soil, from the nutrient-poor soil, that they mainly invested in flowers and seed production. So they are not necessarily smaller, but they produce fewer seeds and fewer flowers. However, there's a group of sundew species from Australia which cannot take up nitrogen effectively from the soil anymore. They have a mutation in the genes producing that enzyme, and they really starve if they do not get any insects. So they really they depend on these insects. But yes, there had been studies. So
fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to bring up my Q&A again and see what else we've got for our speakers before seeing if our speakers have questions for one another, which they may do. So we had a kind comment from Advoli, apologies if I've said your name incorrectly, who congratulates you, Sergey, for your talk. And then a more specific question about whether you have a view, Sergey, whether climate change is impacting the plants that you are growing in your botanic garden specifically. We might just ask you to turn the mute button off if that's all right.
Sorry. Thank you, Chris. Действительно, мы такие изменения наблюдаем. Так, например, еще совсем недавно для нас было в новинку выращивать, например, абрикосы в условиях открытого грунта в Перми.
In fact, we see that changes in the climate. For example, several years ago, it was impossible to imagine that we can grow the apricots here in the Urals.
А на протяжении последних лет у нас абрикосы прекрасно цветут, плодоносят и дают хороший урожай.
And last few years, they blossom, grow up, and give the real собственно, урожай. Был как по-английски.
Не знаю, не помню.
I think we understand the so thank you very much. Thank you. And now for our audience, I'm aware that we've gone over the allotted time, but this is the break time, so I think people can decide to go away if they want to. So we've had all of the questions from our audience addressed. I would like to read out a comment to you all, in case you haven't seen it, which is that we need more of these sorts of presentations. It creates awareness, very educational and inspiring, and motivates action. So I hope you agree. Our audience has been very engaged, and we've had a lot of positive comments. So thank you all so much for those. I would just like to see if our speakers here have any questions for one another before we close the Q&A. And Andreas, you've put your hand up.
Yes, just for interest, I have a question to Sergey. How it is to run tropical greenhouses in an area with a very long winter and 2 meters of snow cover. I know it from Munich already, where we have much fewer snow cover in winter, and still there are some winters where the gardeners have problems with the snow load on the greenhouses. So they either have to heat the glass of the roofs, or they have to climb on the roofs to shovel it, to get rid of the snow. So I can imagine that this is challenging in the Permian region, right?
Проблем со снежным покровом, да?
Да, как особенно нагрузка, если снеговая нагрузка.
Да, действительно, у нас проблемы такие существуют, но мы их успешно решаем.
Absolutely, there are these changes. These changes take place, but как вы их решаете?
Дело в том, что наши оранжереи покрыты поликарбонатом, сотовым поликарбонатом или монолитным поликарбонатом, поэтому снег на них долго не держится.
Our greenhouses are covered with the plastic polycarbonate. Yeah. And the snow don't lay long on these surfaces.
Но я хочу сказать, что за фруктами мы в магазины не ходим. У нас растут в оранжереях и ананасы, и бананы, и папайя.
Sergey says that he never uses the supermarkets for buying the fruits because the greenhouse provides him with pineapples, bananas. What else?
Papaya.
Papaya.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the speakers? One of them, Mazin?
Yeah, I have a question for the other people. How they, we were trying our garden to have more natural areas and just label the wild plants that are in the garden. And one of the areas that I have difficulty with is the succession that happens, whether, natural or unnatural, I have no idea sometimes. But for example, we had one beautiful area of Adonis, which is now slowly being taken over by grasses, and the Adonis is gone. So natural succession, and how do you all deal with it in your botanic gardens?
I wonder if Nick might have some thoughts on that initially.
We too have had some experience with the natural succession in the creation of our calcareous limestone meadowland. One of the big difficulties in creating a floral rich grassland is the amount of nitrogen you have in the soil. You want to reduce that because the grasses can become dominant. And it was just ironic that the area that we chose, and because of its juxtaposition with the other rare native habitats that we already created, had quite rich soil and quite a deep soil. So we removed a lot of the soil to a depth of about 20 centimeters, and we recycled that soil as part of the garden development, and we imported lots of crushed limestone to dust from a local quarry and amalgamated that into the lower soil horizons. And the effect of that is, after collecting on the downland area local to us the seeds and sowing them, is that most of the broadleaf flowering plants develop some aspect of a taproot system which goes through the dry substrate into the moisture level below. But the grasses that we wanted to create in our sort of balanced meadow have many fibrous roots. And we started with 12 species of grasses, and 6 years later we were down to 4. We've had to recollect and resow them. So I think if we were doing this again, what we would do is create, rather than a uniform soil preparation, but create different soil preparations in the same display to create different, slightly variation in growing environments for the different plants. Because of course in nature, the growing environment is not uniform. It's actually varied. The underlying geology comes near the surface, you get thin soil, it goes well below the surface, you get deep nutrient-rich soil, and the tapestry of plants that you get in the natural environment, literally in a linear 100 meters, is very, very different. So I think if we were doing that again, that's what we would do. Your Adonis you speak of course, that's an autumn germinating annual, which flowers in early spring, going to summer, and then it has winter dormancy. So it would need disturbed ground, and perhaps the grasses that are establishing your area are part of the natural succession. And in nature, that ground will be disturbed by rockfalls, avalanche, by animals digging, creating burrows or disturbance when they're feeding, and then that plant would grow as an opportunist. And of course, those annual plants have done very well in agricultural systems prior to the invention of agricultural herbicides. So you may want to replicate some of those disturbances to bring that seed bank to the soil. I think it's a species that has quite a long life in the seed bank. So I would do some experiments and do some disturbing and remove some of the grass and turn the soil over a bit at this time of year, and look out for the germination of some seedlings from the seed bank.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks everyone for this very engaging Q&A. I found it very informative and very enjoyable. We've had some other lovely comments from our audience about just how much they've enjoyed this session, and I for sure have. So I just would like to say our heartfelt thanks to all of you for such wonderful talks and a lively and informative discussion. So thank you ever so much. I appreciate everyone's patience because I know we are running behind schedule, but there will now be a break before the next session, which will be chaired, as I said earlier, by Paul Smith from BGCI, and that will commence at 5 p.m. our time. So that's in about 15 minutes time, and you'll see a holding screen until then. So thank you very much, everyone.